So I'm starting to dig into Heidegger's Being in Time. I'm only part of the way through the book, but he has some very interesting concepts that I think could be some food for thought for everyone. Now, one of the most important things about Heidegger is that his level of thinking is so abstract that I think that's part of the reason why Sein und Zeit is so difficult, because if you compare it to Hegel, for example, there's often kind of, which is harder, the phenomenology of spirit or being in time. And I would say they're both difficult in different ways. Having read Hegel at the beginning of the phenomenology, I found it very difficult and I found his language very abstract. But you quickly get a sense for kind of what he's trying to talk about, and it becomes fairly intuitive after a while, especially when you get used to the way he uses things like, for example, Biglyph and for like the concepts, and uses the term concept in the singular with, the capital, the very, powerful, the world as a concept that is to be realized. And then you compare it to Being in Time, where he uses more clear language. Oftentimes Hegel likes to take the long way around different ways of saying things, whereas Heidegger says it very plainly, but the kind of stuff that he's trying to get us to think about is the kind of thing that we aren't usually oriented to. And as such, he wants us to start talking about being from a very basic perspective. And he thinks that basically when we've been doing ontology or metaphysics in the past, we haven't really been doing any ontology of any kind. For example, he is highly critical of Descartes, especially in his I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. He says that, well, we really don't know what we mean by sum, by I am. We understand what it is to think, kind of ontically, we understand the experience of thinking, but we don't really know what being is. And we have tried to come up with ideas of being, but they're all ontically bound. They're all within a certain world of understanding, and they're all kind of worldly understandings, not to be confused with like the worldliness of man, which is kind of a thing that has been stressed by McCory and Robinson in their translation, is that the idea of worldliness is not like some sort of like theological worldliness. It's just the idea of being within a world. And Heidegger, kind of taking his cue for the beginning of existentialism and really bringing existentialism forward, talks about always being within a world, basically, and having worldliness as part of Dasein. And Heidegger wants us to start talking about being from the kind of being that we find ourselves in the most. He says, the kind of dealing which is closest to us is, as we have shown, not a bare perceptual cognition, but rather that kind of concern which manipulates things and puts them to use. And this has its own kind of knowledge. He goes on to say, such entities are not thereby objects for knowing the world theoretically. They are simply what gets used, what gets produced, and so forth. So this is kind of the lead-in into tool being, which is, Heidegger is famous for talking about hammers. And it's kind of a good way to get into Heidegger, because this idea of tool being is kind of the most basic form of being. It's almost pre-phenomenological. It's so simple, and the way that we deal with it, he says, this is the way in which everyday Dasein always is. When I open the door, for instance, I use the latch. The achieving of phenomenological access to the entities which we encounter consists rather in thrusting aside our interpretive tendencies, which keep thrusting themselves upon us and running alongside with us. So he basically says that the way in which we interact with the world, and this is an important concept that I really don't think people like Kant really held on to, is the idea that when we do cognize the world, it's not always an active cognization. For example, when we go throughout the world, and when I get done with this video and I open my door, I don't necessarily consciously think of opening the door. And this is something that if you listen to Dreyfus talk about Heidegger, he talks about really the only time that these tools get cognized to that higher level is if something goes wrong. Say the door gets stuck or something, or the handle's not working, or the handle falls off. You're suddenly left with the barrenness of the door and the fact that the door has a very particular use. It has a presence at hand, a Vorhandenheit, which is not really realized in everyday being. And this Vorhandenheit is kind of a really important concept in Heidegger because it gets us to think about the way in which our world is structured at its base level. And I think this is a good way to start talking about being the way Heidegger would want it, is to start thinking about tool being, about the way in which, as we go through the world, we're really not cognizing everything as a begriff, as a concept or an idea. It's very much a laid back approach. And this sort of intuition that Heidegger brings, I think Hegel brings to an extent as well, but Heidegger in a very different way, in that he wants us to understand being much more from experience than maybe someone like Hegel would.